When you take psilocybin or DMT or other hallucinogenic substances, the brain, it opens the doors of perception. If you look at a lot of the DMT stories, that are identical to alien abductions.
What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? Are we creating reality?
The universe itself is far more complex than we can ever imagine, and that 94% of it is missing. The reason we think that everything out there is real is because we see things. We're existing in a universe that is non-physical, that is brought into existence by the act of observation, and it's only a tiny part of it. This is how reality works, and it is all to do with, believe it or not, black holes. It's called the many worlds interpretation, and it argued that this doubling of the universe has been happening billions of times a second since the first moment of the Big Bang. Consciousness itself is created by quantum effects. There is no space, there is no time. It's all a thought, it's all a great thought. Generally, people, when they are close to death, they will experience going through a tunnel of light. They will have the idea that time is slowing down. A young Japanese-American researcher called Jimo Borjigin was doing work with rats, and when they opened up the brains, much to their astonishment, in the pineal gland, they found DMT. Do you get deja vu?
Yeah.
Okay, you're in the simulation.
Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really excited to have our conversation here today.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. It's going to be fun.
You know, you've written extensively about consciousness. How would you define it? And do you believe it exists independently of the brain?
Yes, I do. I mean, it effectively, the idea that consciousness is created by the brain is something that has long fascinated me, because for me, the argument is, well, consciousness is something, a completely different substance, for want of a better term, than the physical matter that surrounds it. And of course, thought and consciousness are literally non-physical. They have no extension in space. So therefore, they're very different. This is a technical term that philosophers use called substance dualism. So clearly, there is something different about thought. There's something different about consciousness. And I'm not original in saying this, but, you know, it's self-evident to me that the brain processes consciousness. The brain is a receiver of consciousness, that consciousness exists in a field around us. And this is more and more what quantum mechanics are telling us about the true nature of reality. Now, for me, as I've used in a number of my books, I've turned around and I've said, well, if consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain processes, which is the technical term for it, it's an accidental thing that just comes to existence spontaneously at a certain point when there's a certain level of complexity in the brain. The question I have to ask materialist reductionists on this is, what is it? Is the addition of one atom? Is it the addition of one quark? Is it an addition of one electron? Does consciousness slowly appear, or does it instantaneously appear? And that's where the problem lies. Now, we do know there's a direct one-to-one relationship between areas of the brain and what certain areas of the brain do. But the same analogy could be used for a radio. You know, you take out valves in a radio and the radio ceases to function. Also, they will argue that, you know, you take entheogens, you take dimethyltryptamine, LSD, these kind of things, and the brain changes. You get brain damage. And yes, of course you do, but it's still damage to the ability of the brain to process the information. And we can talk a little bit about this later with some real interesting research that associates of mine are doing at Imperial College and at the University of Sussex as well, which are finding some extraordinary things about how the brain relates to substances such as dimethyltryptamine and psilocybin as well. So the science is there, you know, it's very much so. So no, I believe that consciousness is prime. Everything is an emanation of consciousness. And again, we can touch on my overarching hypothesis on this as we move on.
In your view, what is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? Are we creating reality, or are we participants in it?
Well, I suppose the thing is that consciousness is the only thing that we know. That we are a self-aware something, perceiving something, is all we can possibly know. And the major issue that a lot of scientists have with the role of consciousness and the role of substance dualism is simply that if my consciousness is non-physical in some way, by definition, how does it have any effect in the physical world? In other words, how can something non-physical facilitate the movement of my hand, facilitate the movement of my tongue to enunciate these words? And clearly there's a massive problem there if we go along the line of substance dualism, the idea that both there is matter and consciousness, because it simply doesn't work. So there has to be, like, for instance, if I push something, I push it because the motive force is my finger pushing something. Now, if I have no motive force because I have no physical presence as such, how do I move anything? But if we go back and move away from the substance, the Cartesian dualism idea, and go to the original Vedanta beliefs and everything else as well, and the idea that everything is consciousness, that everything is an emanation of consciousness, the problem goes away. Suddenly you have non-dualism, and suddenly you have the idea that everything effectively is consciousness. Or what I would counter-argue and say it's more complex than that. It's not. Consciousness is part of a consciousness field, and the consciousness field itself is digital in format. It is mathematical, and we know that in mathematical forms are non-physical. You can never turn around and physically say that a quadratic equation has any kind of physical reality. It doesn't. It's the human brain manipulating numbers in one way or another. And we're discovering more and more in terms of cosmology that the universe itself is far more complex than we can ever imagine. And that 94% of it is missing. We have elements of dark energy, dark matter, these kind of things. But more importantly, we have the basic knowledge of what quantum mechanics tells us. Now, for example, I've used this example many times, but I think it's profoundly important to make it, that we assume that the physical world around us is A, physical, it has solidity, and B, that it exists outside of us in one way or another. And what I will do is I'll now take that apart in terms of a philosophical and a physiological concept. The outer shell of any atom within any molecule is negatively charged. Electrons are, by definition, negatively charged. That's why they're electrons as opposed to positrons, which are positively charged. So when you put something that's negatively charged against something that's negatively charged, like two negative ends of a magnet, they get repulsed. And this is exactly what is happening. When you have a sensation of feeling something, what you're actually doing, it's being repulsed. You are hovering above. And your backside at the moment on that chair is hovering above it. So the first point is physical matter is mostly empty space. Okay, so that's the first important point. So when we turn around and we believe that there is some physical world out there, it isn't. Now let's move on to how we believe what is out there is real in some way. Yeah. The reason we think that everything out there is real is because we see things. Basically, the major sense we have is seeing. But seeing in itself as a process is absolutely magical and peculiar, and modern science has no idea how it works. But what is more important, we have to realize that we see from photons, that is tiny bits of light. Well, technically they are bosons, which are actually carriers of an information field, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And these tiny photons are given off by a light source like the sun, and there's countless numbers of them. Now, each photon itself, what happens is the photon literally bounces off an object. So the photons hit like a rose. You're seeing a rose in front of you. The photons hit the rose, and if it's a red rose, what happens is the energy of that photon is taken in by the surface of the rose, with the exception of one part of the electromagnetic spectrum, particular vibration, which we see as red. Okay?
Okay.
So everything else is sucked in, and what bounces back into our eyes is the bit that we are programmed to see as red. But red exists nowhere. Okay? Red exists nowhere. No color exists anywhere. Because literally all that it happens is we're programmed with a particular vibrational state, because the electromagnetic spectrum is just a series of vibrations. And we'll touch on them in a little bit more. But they're a series of vibrations. That's all they are. The remains of the photon bounces back. What happens is it crosses the space between the rose and your eye, and it goes into your eye. And the interesting thing again about photons is people think that there's a tiny little object called a photon, and it moves and it comes to your eye. The photon that leaves the rose is not the same photon that hits your eye, because what is happening is it's energy being transferred. So a photon will hit another photon and hit another photon, or technically it will hit an atom in the air, and the atom will take in that energy and fire out some more energy. So literally all the time, what we think we are directly interfacing with people, that we're not. But let's argue that it is one object. It then goes into your pupil, and then it crosses the aqueous humor, which is the liquid in the eye, and it arrives at the back of the eye at a place called the retina. Now, the retina is light sensitive. Okay, so it will react to a photon, and it will realize the photon has hit it. So how could one photon interfere with another photon if they're solid objects? So what they did, and this is extraordinary, what they did is they decided to put a measurement device on one of the slits to see which hole the photon went through, and whether they went through singly, and what happened. Subatomic particles, effectively, when they are not observed, before they are observed, are a statistical wave. And the statistical wave, and this gets quite technical here, but the statistical wave is quite a simple one. It's a statistical chance of whether a particle is found in a particular location or another. Okay, so, the chances, if you've got a particle in a box, there is a massive chance you're going to find it in one position or another. But there is also a very tiny opportunity that the particle could be outside the box altogether, which again is quite weird, which is even weirder, which I won't have time to go into. So they've concluded that consciousness, or the act of observation, this is called the Copenhagen interpretation, proves that what we think is physical reality around us, made up of tiny point particles that we bring into existence by the act of observation. Now, this then gets extremely strange, and I'll go back to light again, because light, visible light, is part of what's called the electromagnetic spectrum. And the light is just the part of this big vibrationary field that our eyes are programmed to be able to see. But there's tons of it we can't see. How much tons of it we can't see? I did an analysis in one of my books on this. What we think is visual reality is 1.5 inches about 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. That's what we believe is everything. Now, this means that our perceptions are very, very tightly attuned. So we're existing in a universe that is non-physical, that is brought into existence by the act of observation, and it's only a tiny part of it. There was a very famous paper written a few years ago called What It Is Like to Be a Bat, by a philosopher who argued, well, how do bats see the world? Well, a bat echolocates. It uses sound to locate where things is. So it has a visual system that is completely different to ours. It's created by us collectively. And we all collectively create this because we are all observers. And, you can imagine if you're observing one thing, you're seeing it from one angle, somebody else is seeing it from another, but you're co-creating that reality. Now, this is exactly what they argue in the Vedanta. This is exactly what they argue in lots of Eastern religions. But modern science is showing more and more that this is how reality works. And it is all to do with, believe it or not, black holes, the second law of thermodynamics. Now, then again, the science I'm talking here is not woo-woo science. This is serious science. Now, again, I was talking about the issue of the observer. In the people like Einstein had a real problem with this, and they thought, I cannot believe that the moon isn't, as Einstein said, I cannot believe that the moon isn't there if I'm not looking at it. And what happened was that there was a thought experiment put forward by a guy called Erwin Schrödinger. And it was called Schrödinger's cat. And it was the idea that if we are creating by our act of observation subatomic particles, and subatomic particles don't exist unless they are observed. What would happen if you placed inside a box, a sealed box, a live cat, and some atoms that had a 50-50 chance of decaying? Atoms decay statistically. We know that certain atoms will decay. There's a 50-50 chance that this atom will decay within a half an hour period. And you lock the cat in the box and you attach to the atom that may or may not decay a device that is sensitive. And if it detects that the subatomic particle is decayed, it will trigger a little hammer, which will drop down and smash a little glass vial, which is full of cyanide gas, which will then released, it will kill the cat. Now, assuming the cat is not the observer, they put the cat in the box, they seal the box, and they wait for half an hour. Now, because there are no observers in the box, assuming the cat isn't the observer, and there is a 50-50 chance that a subatomic particle that technically doesn't exist because it's not being observed is in the box. It means that the cat is both alive and dead in the box at the same time. Okay?
Yeah.
This is called Schrödinger's cat. And the argument is that when the box is opened, you'll find either a dead cat or a live cat, depending on, but it nothing should have happened. Now, in 1957, a young American PhD student called Hugh Everett III came up with a solution, and the solution was extraordinary. He said that the cat is both alive and dead when the box is opened. And at that point, the universe splits into a total copy of itself. One universe contains a scientist who sees a dead cat, and one universe creates a scientist who has a live cat. It's called the many worlds interpretation. And it argued that this doubling of the universe has been happening billions of times a second since the first moment of the Big Bang. So there are literally countless numbers of universes. And there are countless numbers of Ariane and Anthony that are having slightly different conversations than we're having here. There are billions and trillions of versions of you and I. Some of them will be completely different. Now, this again, so there are two belief systems and they're contradictory. We now know that the way in which information works suggests that consciousness itself is created by quantum effects. There is work being done by a guy called, two guys, Stuart Hamerhoff, who's a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose recently won the Nobel Prize for Physics. These two guys have come together and said, what is really happening is what we believe is consciousness is a quantum effect. And there are tiny structures within the neurons of the brain called microtubules. And these microtubules draw up consciousness from a consciousness field. Consciousness itself exists as a single consciousness. And we are individuated consciousnesses. Now, within Vedanta, there's the concept, isn't there, of Brahman. And we're all a dream of Brahman. Consciousness is just one thing. And it reduces down like waves on an ocean. But suddenly we have this model of reality that is far more complex, far more interesting. And this has been the central theme of my writings. Now, there's one other quantum effect that I really need to talk to you about before we get into other things, so we've got the full picture. And it's called superposition, or it's basically if you put two subatomic particles in the same quantum state, and then you place them miles apart. If you do one thing to one of the particles, the other one knows instantaneously. Now, this again was first suggested. Well, it's a weird story, actually. Initially, when Einstein was upset about Schrödinger's cat and everything else and all these other things, he also didn't like this idea of subatomic, how subatomic particles worked. And he came up with a thought experiment with two associates. It was called the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky thought experiment. I won't go into details about it, but effectively what happened was somebody proved that Einstein was wrong in his interpretation in 1964. A physicist called John Bell who was at CERN, and he did a mathematical calculation. Einstein argued that if the rules apply, if you apply the rules of quantum mechanics, it would suggest that particles can communicate instantaneously. And we know that they can't. When we think of the universe as having space and time, there isn't. There is no space. There is no time. It's all a thought. It's all a great thought. So suddenly we're in the position now that, well, consciousness seems to be far more interesting now. So consciousness doesn't need to be in the brain.
I've had an NDE personally as well. And I wanted to ask you, how do near-death experiences fit into your theories of consciousness, the nature of the self?
I differentiate between near-death experiences and real death experiences. Okay. And I argue that something very peculiar happens in the brain at the point of death. Now, I don't know if you know, there's something called the Moody traits. And the Moody traits were put forward by a guy called Raymond Moody, who was the first guy to really write about near-death experiences, I think in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And he over interviewing many, many people who'd had these weird experiences whereby they'd either been in car crashes, they'd fallen into comas, they had various things. They described things that happened to them. And generally people, when they are close to death, they will experience seeing, going through a tunnel of light. They will have the idea that time is slowing down. They will have a sensation of rising up, of meeting something they call the being of light. They will then have what's called a panoramic life review. My life flashed before my eyes. And a number of other experiences. Now, what I do is I take these traits and I say, what is really happening with these? What are happening neurologically? Why do we have the sensation that time is expanding when we're having a near-death experience? And it's all to do with the brain, and it's all to do with neurotransmitters in the brain. Within the brain, there are tiny structures called neurons. And neurons, there are billions and billions of neurons in the adult brain. Okay. And the neurons themselves can be quite long and thin, but they never touch each other. And how they communicate by sending messages to each other is they have things called dendrites, which are kind of spindly fingers that stretch out. And at the end of each dendrite is something called a synaptic gap. And each synaptic gap comes close to another neuron, but it doesn't touch. And at the end of each of the synapses, there are what are called vesicles, which hold particular chemicals. And depending upon what message the brain is wanting to receive is what chemicals are released at the end. And they're like a spray that comes out from one side, and the other side, they have what's called receptor sites, which take in the chemicals and then carry them down to the next dendrite at the end of theirs. And this is how the brain transfers messages across the brain. There are around about 100 of these different chemicals, and they're called neurotransmitters for obvious reasons. They're transmitters that transmit information in the neurons. And they do very different things. Like, there's things like dopamine and serotonin and they do different things to us. They heighten our mood, they make us happy, they make us sad, they make us go to sleep, they do various things. But over recent years, they've discovered something quite strange, because they found that there are things called the TARS receptors, which are trace amine-associated receptors in the brain. And these receptor sites, which again are the other side of the receiving neuron, the other side of the synaptic gap, receptor sites are a little bit like a key and a lock. So they can react only to certain chemicals. And the trace amine-associated receptor sites were a great mystery because nobody knew which neurotransmitter they worked with. They were totally puzzled. But recent research have made an astonishing discovery. These trace amine-associated receptor sites seem to work with one particular chemical, a chemical called dimethyltryptamine. Now, dimethyltryptamine is the most powerful hallucinogenic substance known to man. well, technically it isn't. There's something called 5-MeO DMT, which is even more powerful. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, has been known for many, many years as a powerful hallucinogenic substance. Okay. And for years, when people have been taking this substance, they have things like near-death experiences, even though they're not dying. Also, there is another substance called ketamine, which also is a synthetic, it's a horse tranquilizer, and also a very popular synthetic drug that people take in clubs and things. But they discovered that there must be another chemical in the brain that seems to be very like ketamine. Now, people, when they take ketamine, have near-death experiences. They have all the things of near-death experiences, the floating out of the body, the time slowing down. So clearly, whatever is taking place in a near-death experience, it's generated by one of these neurotransmitters, is DMT in the body. And they found it. It's been in the stomach, it's in the spine, and it's in many plants and everything else. But it's never been discovered in the brain. So they thought, well, clearly it's not active in the brain. So the whole point is ridiculous. Until 2014, when a young Japanese-American researcher called Jimo Borjigin was doing work with rats. And they were examining the brains of recently deceased rats. And when they opened up the brains, much to their astonishment, in the pineal gland, they found DMT. So they found DMT within the brains of live rats. Okay, these rats, sorry, but they had been live. Now, this is extraordinary because the DMT was there for a reason, and the question was, how did it get there? But more extraordinarily, why was it in the pineal gland? Now, this is where any of your listeners, watchers that are based in India might find this quite interesting. And I'm really keen to have feedback on this because I've done some research on this. And there is a technique that is done by the Sudras, the mystic people in India, a technique called Kakara Mudra. And Kakara Mudra, the athletes, they train themselves to place their tongue at the back. They curl their tongue back, and they do this because they want to taste something called Amrit, the nectar of transcendence, which is a sharp-tasting substance that when they taste it, they have altered states of consciousness. So it's rather like taking a hallucinogenic substance, but they don't need to because they do it by doing this with their tongue. And I've made some astonishing links. It seems that at the 49th day of gestation, when the Buddhists believe that consciousness comes into the brain at the 49th day of gestation, which is quite interesting. But at the 49th day of gestation, the baby in the womb is growing. And at that time, there is a small object at the back of the throat of the embryo called the epiphysis. And it sits at the back of the throat. And as the baby develops, it moves from the back of the throat up to the center of the brain. So by the time the baby is, just before the baby is born, the epiphysis splits into two glands. One of them becomes the pituitary gland, and one becomes the pineal gland. When they move up, they leave something called Rathke's pouch or Rathke's cleft, which is like a little channel. I suddenly realized there's something, they're tasting dimethyltryptamine. And then I spoke to various neurochemists and various other people, and I discovered something quite interesting. The pineal gland exists. Pineal gland's a great mystery. If you open up somebody's brain and take the two hemispheres apart, you'll find that there is double most things within the brain. So there's two cerebral hemispheres, there's two amygdalas, there's two hippocampi, and various other things. But there's only one or two little objects that are not doubled. And one of them sits right at the center of the brain, called the pineal gland. And this was of such mystery that people many years ago used to believe that this was where the soul was. Now, there are a group of people in India called the Kashmiri shavists. They wear particular hats to protect the pineal gland. Okay, and in one of my earlier books, I discussed this. in great detail. Okay. And again, if there's any Kashmiri shavists out there, please, guys, tell me if I'm right and wrong on this. Whether I'm right is another matter. But in my book, The Hidden Universe, the Opening the Doors of Perception, I discuss this. So then a guy called René Descartes came along, French philosopher, and he argued that the pineal gland, again, was the seat of the soul, because it seemed to be. But doing research on the role of the pineal gland, we now know what the pineal gland does, in effect. And what it's there to do, it's there to create a substance called melatonin. And melatonin is a chemical or that puts us to sleep, because the pineal gland is also light sensitive. So when people talk in India about the third eye, and that's why Hindus have this little round dot there, because the pineal gland is around about 6 inches behind. Yeah. Now, the pineal gland takes other chemicals and puts them together and synthesizes them into melatonin. Now, melatonin, why the pineal gland is light sensitive is it sits above something called the optic nerve. The thing I was telling you about that takes these signals from the retina to the back of the brain. Yes. So directly underneath the pineal gland, it crosses between the two eyes. It's something called the optic chiasma. And the pineal gland sits directly above. And the reason the pineal gland sits directly above is it needs to know that signals, light signals, are moving along the optic nerve, because as soon as the light signals start to decrease, it's dark outside, it starts to synthesize melatonin, because melatonin makes you go to sleep. And dimethyltryptamine, the actual atomic structure, the molecule structure, of dimethyltryptamine is very similar. I think I'm right in saying that I think the only difference is 2 hydrogen atoms. I've actually come up with a term. They call it metatonin as opposed to melatonin, which is endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine. Now, if this is the case, all the legends about the pineal gland and the third eye and opening the third eye suddenly is making sense. So I argue that there's a direct link here with the Kundalini experience. And I was doing some recent research in my new book on this. And I can't go into details, but if anybody's interested, I make the link between the Kundalini experience and something called Reisner's fiber. And I think I can directly link that to the Kundalini experience, because when people turn around, they say that they feel a force from the coccyx at the bottom of the back. It goes up 2 lines. There's the Ida of the Pingala, and it shoots up to the bottom of the brain, where it explodes in this incredible experience of oneness. And I argue that what's happening is the signal is running up, and what it does, it hits the pineal gland. And when it hits the pineal gland, it stimulates the pineal gland to release dimethyltryptamine, to flood the brain with dimethyltryptamine. Now, and I think this is what happens at the point of death. The dimethyltryptamine is released at the point of death to create the near-death experience. Now, people I know, I'm working with researchers at the moment on dimethyltryptamine. There's massive research being done in the UK at the moment. There's been research done at the University of Sussex, where they've made some fascinating recent discoveries regarding psilocybin, which is another hallucinogenic substance, magic mushrooms. They did an experiment because what they wanted to know was how psilocybin created hallucinations. When you took magic mushrooms, how come you were projected into a different world and you saw all these strange things? And they concluded that what must happen is that the psilocybin must in some way activate in the brain to make different parts of the brain talk to each other and create the hallucinations, draw up dreams, as it were, and make the dreams be experienced in normal reality, waking states. So what they did was they took a load of volunteers, and they did this expecting to find that different areas of the brain would light up. They discovered the absolute opposite. The psilocybin switched the brain off. It switched off parts of the brain. And the reason I believe it switched off parts of the brain is it stopped the brain's ability to act as an attenuator. In other words, the brain's there to take out information. I was telling you about the information field and the way in which there's far more information that we can't perceive because our brain doesn't process it. Yes. When you take psilocybin or DMT or other hallucinogenic substances, the brain is stopped doing it. It's not allowed to restrict you. And in doing so, it opens the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley said in 1954. It opens up the doors of perception. Now, this then starts to get really weirder and weirder. Because if this is the case, it means that we are programmed to exist in this simulation, this matrix-like thing, and there are many other things that exist out there that we can't see. Now, in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I argue that there are people, normal people, who perceive the greater universe. And I call it Huxleyan spectrum. And it's the idea that I'm not a neurotypical, but neurotypicals, people whose doors of perception are really closed, don't only see the reality they're supposed to see. But if the doors of perception are open slightly by the way in which your brain works, whether it's releasing hallucinogenic substances via the neurotransmitters, you see the universe in a slightly different way. Now, I suffer from classic migraine. And when I suffer from classic migraine, I have aura states where I see things that aren't there. I lose my sight, I go partially blind, and I see things moving around me. And I'm starting to perceive the reality behind the reality, the holographic nature of the reality. If you take migraine to its furthest length, temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, they have precognitive aura states. They go out of their body. They go to different places. And in my books, I have many people who experience TLE who explain to me their experiences. And I know there'll be TLEers out there that'll be going, my God, this guy's telling it as it is. This is how I experience the universe. And TLEers, of course, can't explain what they're experiencing to other people because other people just don't see the things they're seeing. Nobody has any idea what hallucinations are, how they're created, how the brain creates them. They don't know. So you then move further on and you get to schizophrenia, where the doors of perception are wide open. And schizophrenics cannot deal with the information that's coming in. It's coming in from everywhere, and it literally drives them crazy. They hear voices in their heads. They have visions. They have all these things. The schizophrenia is causing the madness. They're going mad because they can't deal with the information they're dealing with. Now, within all this, there is also some other things I discussed that I think is also involved in here. It's to do with Alzheimer's disease, which means effectively by destroying the microtubules, it opens up the doors of perception. Again, in exactly the same way that the experiments at Sussex University discovered. It stops the brain. This is what happens. Also, I think people who have autism also have the same issues. Now, also, and I think it's all probably linked in some way or other to the pineal gland and endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine. Now, where it gets freaky is that some other friends of mine. Now, by the way, the new book, the foreword for the new book is written by Dr. Pascal Michael, who's one of the young up-and-coming neuroscientists.
Oh, wow.
And Pascal has been heavily involved in a lot of this research. So the research, I'm getting it firsthand from people who are doing it. You know, I'm not some new age wacko that's just making it up as I go along. It's not. It's real science. So the guys are doing research at Imperial College in London, and what they're doing there is their volunteers are taking dimethyltryptamine intravenously. So they're putting it in their veins, and what they're doing is, under control conditions, they're then going into the DMT world. Now, everybody that takes DMT tells me that when you go to the DMT, it's the real world. That's the real world. This is the hallucination. We are the people in the hallucination. They say as soon as you get to this place, the colors are brighter, everything's more stark, it's more real, and it's extraordinary. Every single person that takes DMT reports this, by the way. So what happens is they go out and then they come back after about 20 minutes and they report what they see and they record them. And they're getting some extraordinary results. And very, very disturbing results. Not only this, they're encountering entities that know they're coming. And I'll give an example of this. One of my friends, a university lecturer called Carl told me that he was one of the volunteers, went into the DMT cage, they called it. You're kind of floating in this reality and there's all these weird things happening around you. Like an alien came over to him, like an alien grey. And it prodded him on the shoulder. And it said, you shouldn't be doing it this way. You should not be doing it this way. And it faded back. And he comes to, and he said to his friend, it's really weird. One of the entities spoke to me. So 2 weeks later, he gets injected in, he goes back, he's in the place. The same creature comes over and says, I told you last time, this is not how you should be doing it. Please find other ways of communicating with us, and receded back. Now, as Carl told me, he said, if that was my subconscious, it was telling me something I didn't want to hear. And he said, but that creature recognized me. That creature had been somewhere else in that 2-week period and was expecting me to come back, which means that the creatures he was experiencing are consciousnesses in their own right. They have motivations. They're not hallucinations. They are real creatures. And in my book, The Hidden Universe, I discuss this in great detail because I draw parallels between these creatures and the creatures my mother was seeing and alien greys. Also, if you look at a lot of the DMT stories that have been encountered over the years, and you draw parallels between them and near-death experiences that are identical to alien abductions. When a shaman is trained, they by dancing or by rhythmic drums or by taking substances like ayahuasca, they go into altered states of consciousness. And when they go into altered states of consciousness, in part of their initiation is literally being eviscerated. It's having experiments, it's having your guts torn out, dismembered in the most painful way possible. Now, and then you're put together again, and it's part of shamanic tradition. This is what happens with people with DMT. They find themselves in this other place, and there's aliens around them, these creatures, these mantids, and they cut into them, and they experiment on them. Now, we know from alien encounters and alien abductions. Now, by the way, you're probably not aware, but every year now, I do a big event in Southern California called Contact in the Desert. They feel they're being cut into, because they say, don't they, they get taken out of the body. And I chatted with, while I was there, with Whitley Strieber, the famous guy, because Whitley is really fascinated by my models. I met him in London a few weeks ago as well to discuss these very ideas. And of course, Whitley's aliens are just like these creatures. And there's one incident where a young person describes a group of people, and again, it's interesting from the Indian viewpoint, where she said they look like Indian Rajas because they had headsets on.
Oh, yeah.
And they were doing experiments on her. But it's exactly the same as the alien encounters that take place, in some of the Betty and Barney Hill stuff. It clearly is profoundly similar. It's the same phenomenon. Now, on top of that, in my research, I found a series of near-death experiences that were recorded in Papua New Guinea by a lady called Counts, who was a Canadian anthropologist in the 1950s. Some of these stories that these people in a very indigenous culture in the middle of the jungles describe near-death experiences and describe alien encounters in their near-death experiences. One guy, he actually finds himself walking along a road. He meets people who are already dead. Then he finds himself rising up in the air, and he finds himself in a house. And in the description, he describes the house, and he said it was hovering and going round. And there was a ladder outside. But how he got in there was a beam of light that pulled him in to the hovering. It's a UFO. It is obviously a UFO. And he goes in there, and guess what? They do experiments on him. Then they let him back down again. Now, this to me was fascinating. And last year at Contact in the Desert, I was fortunate enough to be in the same area as Travis Walton, who had exactly the same experience as this guy had. Exactly the same. But this guy interpreted it as a near-death experience. But near-death experiences, UFO encounters, they're all the same thing. We seem to go into this altered state of consciousness whereby our brains take us somewhere else. Now, so people will turn around and say, well, does this mean that Anthony Peake is saying that they're hallucinations? Yes, I am saying they're hallucinations. But seeing as normal reality is an hallucination created by the brain, so are these. So it's a question of what we're talking about when we're talking about reality here. You know, for instance, I have written a book on out-of-body experiences, and
Oh,
many
wow.
of my friends are involved in out-of-body experience research. I mean, there's a young friend of mine that you really need to speak to. It's a friend of mine
Yeah.
called Samantha Lee Treasure, who's got a new book out that's coming out next year on her research into near-death experiences as a graduate anthropologist. And she, for instance, she tells me, and a lot of other people have told me, that some of the people, when they have these out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, they live another life as somebody completely different. They found themselves embodied in somebody else's life. Like Sam, for instance, she regularly, when she's on out-of-body experiences, which are the same as near-death experiences, she finds herself in a place she calls future Tokyo. And she sees this android being, and she's got a job there. Her job is mending undersea cables around Tokyo in the future. And she's underwater doing, working on these cables. And she goes back and she finds herself there regularly. Recently, there was a guy whose report went viral on YouTube. He had a near-death experience whereby he ended up living, I think, for 7 years in his own time as a completely different person. And then he came back and he'd been away for a couple of hours. This again means that time itself is not what we think it is. You know, we talk about time. Well, I've written a book again called A Labyrinth of Time. And in fact, I sent you the link, didn't I? That was the book that the Times of India said it was one of the most important books you have to read to have your brain smashed.
Do you think the light at the end of the tunnel reported in NDEs is a phenomenon of brain chemistry, or does it reflect a deeper reality?
A friend of mine, again, called Bill Murtha. And Bill contacted me about 12 or 13 years ago after my first book came out, because he'd had a near-death experience, the most extraordinary near-death experience, where he had been cycling one spring day along a river wall, a sea wall, in a place called Dawlish in the southeast of England on the coast. And a freak wave knocked him off his bike. And as he was trying to pick his bike up, another freak wave hit him and took him off over the wall, 60 foot down into the sea. And the tide was going out. Now, he was a very strong swimmer. He was a semi-professional soccer player. But because of the cold and the fact that the tide was taking him out, he started to die of hypothermia.
No.
And he's bobbling in the sea. And then he said suddenly he felt different. He felt strange. And then suddenly he realized that he was the sea around him. And he was the seagulls in the air. And he was the cliffs. And he suddenly felt as if his body was expanding outwards to encompass everything. It's called the technical term is called the oceanic feeling. Okay, that is the technical term. It's a guy called Robert Buck wrote a book on this about 1899, something like that. Well worth checking out. But anyway, so then what happens is, and it gets really weird, because what then happened was he's out of his body and he's in a kid's body, and he realizes he's gone back to his childhood, and he's running across the street. And as he's running across the street, he sees the boot of a car come forward to the front of a car coming towards him, and the car hits him, knocks him over, breaks his leg, and he's lying there in agony, lying on the floor. There's a flash, and the next minute, he's in a car looking down at a woman's leg, and the woman is fiddling around with a ladder she's got in her tights, and she's fiddling around, and she looks up, and as she does so, a little boy runs across the street. It's him, and he sees the incident from the point of view of the woman that broke his leg. So suddenly he's in this kind of, his consciousness has risen up, and it's bigger. It's expanding out into other people's consciousnesses. He's a point of consciousness in the hallway of his house. And there's a knock on the front door. And he sees his wife and daughters go to the front door, open the door, and it's a police officer. And the police officer turns around and says, "We're sorry to tell you we found the body of your husband on the beach in Dawlish. He's dead." And he sees his wife, and he feels his wife's pain and his daughter's pain and everything. He's back in the water again. And he's going, "This is just weird." And he said, whenever you say that dying of hypothermia isn't painful, it is, because he could feel all these organs cutting down. But then, just as a wonderful corollary to this story, which has very little, well, it has to do with my hypothesis, but not what we're talking about now. He's in the water, and suddenly he sees people on the beach calling to him, and they throw out a rope, and he grabs it, and they drag him in. They broke 2 or 3 of his ribs as they dragged him in. He's in hospital and he's recovering, and some guy comes to visit him, and it's the guy that put the message out that saved his life. This guy is a pub owner. He owns a public house in Dawlish on the seafront, and he said that he had one of the locals had come in and was an astronomer. And the local had said, "Oh, yes, you can see some great stars here. Do you want me to loan you my telescope?" And the landlord said, "Yeah, that'll be wonderful." So a few days later, the telescope is delivered, and he puts it in one of the high rooms overlooking the bay. One evening, he's looking at the stars, and he can't get to see the stars properly. And so he gives up. So he stands up. And as he stands up, he knocked the telescope. Now, the telescope was kind of located like that. And he knocked it. It went like that. So instead of looking at the sky, it was looking at the land or the sea. And as he's walking out through the door, a voice in his head, which I call the daemon, by the way, a voice in his head goes, look through the telescope. And this voice just says, "Look through the telescope." So he goes, "Well, that's weird." So he goes back without moving the telescope, looks through the telescope. Now you know an astronomical telescope will be reversed, and it will only have a small area of space you can see. He sees Bill in the water through the telescope, and he goes, "My God, there's a man in the water." So he rushes downstairs, phones the police, and that's how he was saved. Now, Bill wrote a book on this called Dying to Live. And again, I interview Bill on my own YouTube channel, so you can see me interviewing this guy, and he tells this story on there. Now, going then, so the oceanic feeling, and I argue the reason you get the oceanic feeling is that, and this is going to get quite weird now, I do the science, and I'm arguing, and I've hinted on it, we're existing in a simulation of our lives. Do you get deja vu?
Yeah.
Okay, you're in the simulation. Anybody out there, by the way, if you get deja vu, you're in a simulation. If you don't get deja vu, you're one of the 30% of people that are living your life for the first time. You only get deja vus as a memory of when you did this before. Because, of course, that's what a deja vu is, isn't it? It's a recognition. You go somewhere and you go, "Oh, I've been here before." We are all living in a simulation at the final seconds of our life. Do you know, we say in the near-death experience, the panoramic life review, that my life flashed before me. I argue that's the big clue, that in a real death experience, it does it in literal time. It doesn't flash in front of you. You live it minute by minute. Now, remember I mentioned about the Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the idea that there are trillions of versions of us having this conversation now. This means, effectively, we are living in a simulation that within the program has an outcome that it can render the collapse of the wave function that I was talking about earlier on, collapses the wave function just like when you load a computer game. This is what your life is. Your life is like a third-person computer program that every outcome of every decision you make is already programmed in there, which means that each life you live, you can live a different life. And the thing that guides you in that life is your game player. And your game player, I call your daemon. We are immortal creatures. We are all creatures I call the daemon. And we're like a game, like, you start a new game and it's a third-person RPG game. Every time you open up a new game, you get a new on-screen version of you, don't you? An on-screen avatar. But the game player remembers the last game. And this is how your daemon guides you through life. It remembers the last game. And it knows what you did last time. And it will try and stop you. And I said about my Huxleyan spectrum, my argument is that depending on how open your doors of perception are, is how communicative your daemon can be.
Wow. Thank you so much, Anthony, for coming here on the show. It's been such an insightful conversation, and I'm sure the audience will be taking a lot home from this. So thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.